everyone, it's Dr. McAllister here, also with Isabel DeClaire the cat, who is a bit hyper today and I can't get her to leave me alone when I make these videos. Funnily enough, she's Izzy for a short, but Isabel DeClaire is her full name. And she's actually named after the wife of one of the people you're going to learn about this week, William Marshall. They skim over Isabel DeClaire in that video that you'll watch, but she's the heiress with castles and lots of cash. And that's also playing her down. She was a pretty important woman in her own right. But yeah, so maybe she just heard her name mentioned enough that she's just going to, jump all over the keyboard. So apologies in advance and always for pets crashing my videos. So this week actually is kind of lumped in together. It's really medieval society and economy. We're going to be talking in class about a few really big terms. I'll mention them in these videos again because they're really important for us and I want to make sure you understand. You will have started off this near pod by watching Monty Python for a laugh. The constitutional peasants. There's some truth in this. There's an awful lot of lies as well, as you're going to see. So the topic of society and economy is really important to any understanding of the Middle Ages. So that's because social structures are power structures. So actually it's kind of politics indirectly as well. Now, agriculture was the main form of income for pretty much anybody in the Middle Ages. We're going to discuss a few exceptions to that in the very last video I make for you today in the Nearpod. So this means that social structures impact the economy, it impacts land holdings, and then it impacts who is able to have power over who. Now, one of the topics we're going to discuss in class more is what I nicknamed the bad F word, feudalism. So in class, we're going to learn what is feudalism. And it's often described like a pyramid that's also a hierarchy. So it's very important to attend class this week to learn more about feudalism. I'm going to make sure that you understand all of these technical terms on the left: fief, vassal, vassalage, homage, fealty, liege. We're going to learn what those are in class. So it's important to come to class because it's easy to get them confused with one another. So in addition to what we're going to learn in class about how these different tiers in the pyramid interact with one another, it's mainly military and agricultural things that ties all these levels together, except for peasants. They're not really involved in the military side of things. So the primary duty of the vassal, which we're learning about in class, the vassal owed his lord military service. He wouldn't go alone though. He would have brought his own vassals with him, or at least a squire or two. And the mounted soldier was the most important. The mounted soldier was called the knight. So a lord mustering an army would rely on his vassals, because there were many layers of vassals, as we'll learn in class. And the peasants would, I say they're not really involved. They are involved in that a lord would rope in his own peasants as foot soldiers. In theory, if he was called to war or called to exercise his military service, he was supposed to bring a lord was supposed to bring all of his vassals with him to fight. But in reality, the number was set. When we start having these relationships set down on paper rather than enacted performatively, we see that they are stipulating how many knights and vassals are expected to bring with them to battle. In peacetime, the role would have been to be the noble's court and to follow him around. But as we get on later in the Middle Ages, it became more common to pay a tax instead of going yourself to fight, because, going yourself to fight was risky. You might be injured or hurt or killed. So instead they started paying a tax instead to their lord. So the lord would be like, right, time to pay up. I want to go and do military service. And then he would use that money to pay mercenaries. And mercenaries are hired fighters. Mercenaries really aren't a thing for a lot of the Middle Ages. because lords could rely upon the feudal system, in theory, to pull the fighters they needed together. So it's all kind of something that develops later in the Middle Ages, and of course is very well known by the early modern period. Feudalism was present in Western Europe, wasn't really an Eastern European thing. The Byzantines did not go in for it, but we do have a few cases of it being exported. I mean, the Normans, who we learned about last week, brought it with them to England after the Norman invasion. They also brought it to Sicily, though, when they took southern Italy. So Sicily before then had not known feudalism because it was kind of under, well, Muslim, Byzantine, Greek control. They also, and we're going to learn about the Crusades soon, the Crusaders brought feudalism with them to the Holy Lands too. Now, I call this the bad F word because an important thing to know about feudalism is that it's a theory. It's a term that historians made up much, much later. So if we actually were able to go back in time or bring a medieval person forward to our time and ask them about feudalism, they wouldn't have a clue what you were going on about. It's not a term that they recognized. I mean, they recognized the term fief and homage and fealty and the rest. They use those terms, but the overall social system of feudalism, no, they would not have recognized that at all. So it's kind of become a dirty word for historians. We criticize it a lot, and there is a lot to criticize, but I do like to teach it to students because it kind of helps you understand, and then you can go and tear it all apart. So it's kind of become a dirty word for historians, in part because it oversimplifies. So as we'll talk about in class, this pyramid, when we start looking at how there's, you can have multiple lords and you could have your own vassals, that pyramid is hugely oversimplified. It's really a tangled web. The other major criticism is how many people in the Middle Ages it leaves out. In particular, where do city dwellers go? Because the whole thing is based around military service and land, and those are things that people in the cities in the Middle Ages don't really do. Also, where do merchants go? They're also not interested, as we'll learn, in land necessarily. Where do artisans go? Now, artisans are those who make things, craftsmen particularly. So an artisan in the countryside, the most common would be the blacksmith, but in the cities you would have had a lot of different skilled workers, from stonemasons to carpenters to metalsmiths, goldsmiths, all sorts of artisans. There's also a lot of debate over how it kind of like boils all the peasants down, and anybody below knights into sort of this like big lumpen class of people, because as the video you're going to watch today from Terry Jones at the Peasant Show, it's actually a lot more complexity to peasant. They're not all dirt poor living in mud and in a hovel. There's a lot of layers of peasants, and they could be free people. They were not necessarily beholden to a lord either. So this is what the other term, I've got a question mark here, I've got burgess question mark. That's a name for a free town dweller in particular. So they're kind of the layer of that peasant, but they live in towns. They're also called burghers, but I've gone for burgess here just so we don't get confused between yum 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 burgers and and town dwellers in the Middle Ages. So there's lots and lots of people who were free and unfree in that lump of peasants in the pyramid. Also, the feudal system really depends where in Europe you are. Some places it seems to have been a lot more common, and this system was ruled the day. But in other places, maybe a little bit like this, though it's not like a universal theory. Also, the size of land holdings varied across Europe. The ability for a lord to give out land varied hugely. Also, it presumes, in the case of England, as we learned last week, the English king has a lot of power because he knows how much money he's got primarily, and he made changes to Parliament. But and other kings in Europe were, pretty, they could be even less wealthy and less powerful than their own lords. I mean, look at the King of France, for example, when we talked about the Normans last week, and we looked at the Angevin Empire. The King of France had less land in France than the King of England did. So certainly the king might not always be in theory, is at the top. Was he in reality? It also leaves out, you know, we said, look, it's lumping all the peasants in together, but it's leaving out the people who are even below the peasants and ignores that actually there would have been a fair number of people who did not participate in this at all, such as orphans, the destitute, widows, depending on where you were in Europe. Magna Carta in England, part of it is actually dedicated to widows' rights. Fun fact, everybody focuses on, oh, it's the first constitution. Not really. But personally, you know, I find the lengthy discussion of widows' rights the most interesting part of Magna Carta. The other thing it leaves out, the other group, are lepers. So leprosy is a disease. It's actually a bacteria. It's it's not known in a lot of the world nowadays because it's a bacteria, and because of that, it's pretty quickly treated. Medieval people were terrified of it. They thought that it was God punishing you. So there was a religious exclusion as well as a medical exclusion with leprosy. And it manifested really horrible. Eventually it kills off your nerves, and then like fingers fall off, your nose falls off, your ears fall off. So it was a horrible disease. So medieval people shunned lepers. They were afraid of them. And there were religious houses that looked after them, sure, but a lot of lepers were left to be beggars, and they were not allowed to be inside the town walls. So there's a lot of criticisms. The term, as I said, it was not a term that a medieval person would be familiar with. It was actually first used in the 17th century to describe the medieval social structure. And it kind of got popular because of Marxist historians. So Marxist historians used the term feudalism to explain the stage in their theory called historical materialism between slave economies and capitalism. That it goes slave economies, and then it goes feudalism, and then it goes capitalism, which is, you know, very oversimplifying historical patterns in and of itself. So maybe feudal society is a bit more forgiving rather than feudalism. Now, we're starting off by looking at the lords, and in class we're mainly going to be focusing on the lords, but the Nearpod today is going to look at lords, and then it's going to look at peasants, and then it's going to look at trade. So one of the things we need to consider is like, what makes you a lord? What makes a lord stand out? What makes them different? And a massive element to what makes a medieval lord is perception. Do people perceive you as being a lord? Do other people interpret you as being a lord? So, you know, it was really in the eye of the beholder. And because it was all about perception, medieval people could be pretty obsessed with retaining certain trappings of lordship. So this first term that I've got in the slide here, sumptuary laws. The sumptuary laws were laws about what people wore, and that's exactly your clothes laws. If you've seen The Handmaid's Tale on Hulu, if you haven't, highly recommend it. But if you've watched The Handmaid's Tale on Hulu, you'll remember that the handmaids all wear red, and the wives all wear that bluey green colour, and then the Marthas wear brown colours. And that's actually an example of a sumptuary law, that they all had their designated colours. This happened in ancient Rome as well. So the only people from the very highest ranks of society in ancient Rome were allowed to wear the colour purple, for example. And that was also because it was the most expensive dye. And sumptuary laws had a real heyday in the Middle Ages as well. So this meant that like lords and people who were nobles, they were allowed certain clothes and trappings and things like, you know, trimmings and gold lace and all this kind of stuff. Whereas peasants were not allowed them legally. And they're particularly become very common after the 14th century because people have got more money. And what do people do when they've got more money? They go shopping. And so this was a particular concern for medieval people later in the Middle Ages because they were getting upset that people who weren't as high social status could dress like them. So that's what a sumptuary law is. But the manner of speaking of a lord would have been apparent, that they had different mannerisms, would have been obvious to a medieval person. And the video from Terry Jones discusses chivalry. And chivalry was the lord's, the knight's code of conduct. So chivalry was this theoretical knightly code of behaviour. So it's part of this nobility complex, this criteria that made you a lord. You know, that you were wealthy, that you had power, you acted a certain way towards the world, you expected the world to act a certain way towards you, your ancestry, your inheritance, the fact that you were skilled on horseback. There's a lot of things go into what makes a lord. Perception is key, as I said. It's not a criteria, it's in terms of your relations to others and how you interact with others. You are constantly defining yourself against other people. And as well as that, there were very subtle things that would indicate a lord, such as food. Only, for example, salmon. If you like the salmon to eat, in the Middle Ages, salmon was reserved by the sumptuary laws only for lords. It was the most expensive fish. Likewise, deer as well. If venison would have been only for lords to eat as well, and these were things that were also regulated in the sumptuary laws. Like the peasants, there were also many different levels of lords. They were not all equals to one another and would have been massively offended for us to believe so. As soon as a lord became the lord over other lords, as soon as he became chief over other nobles, he increased in dignity and importance within that society. So at the very top of the lordship heap is this term tenant-in-chief. And they're also known as barons. So the term tenant-in-chief kind of tells us where they are in the pecking order, and that is, in theory, next one down from the king. They did their homage, their fealty directly to the king for their land, and they would have had a lot of lords underneath them. So to go back to the Normans last week and the Angevin Empire, the King of England was the tenant-in-chief of the King of France, for his lands in France, right? Only for his lands in France, but that's the kind of level of tenant-in-chief we could talk about. A lot of students ask, could you rise up the ranks? Because they've seen that movie, A Knight's Tale, with Heath Ledger in it, and he becomes a knight, and that would not have happened in the Middle Ages because he would not have known all these nuanced things that make a knight. Likewise, being a knight was really expensive, and they would start training children at about the age of like 7, like when they were very small, in how to be a knight. They would have had sword and archery lessons, and they would have been plonked on a horse. So it was not something that you could take up as an adult. People would have definitely noticed. Likewise, really expensive in terms of the training you needed. Your equipment was hugely expensive. Your horses, because as you'll learn in the video, they were specially trained, really expensive. And like, you couldn't have put all of this armor on you yourself. You would have needed men to assist you as well. But as the video discusses, it talks about William Marshall. And he's a really good example of how you could rise through the ranks of lordship. So his is not really a rags to riches story because he wasn't a peasant. He was a younger son of a fairly important lord, and that's kind of towards the bottom of the lordly heap, because in a lot of these societies only the eldest son would inherit, and therefore you kind of had to turf your younger sons out and be like, hey, make a life for yourself. So William Marshall is a really good example of how you could draw attention to yourself by just being really good at being a knight. And he was able to get attention from the king and so acquire a lot of wealth. So a knight was expected to behave a certain way. That's back to this word chivalry, this code of conduct. We think that it probably developed as a fully blown concept in France in the 11th century, and then it was copied elsewhere. It is really part myth. It's debated by historians how much of this was actually enacted. It seems that a lot of it was fake news. A lot of it was propaganda to get these lords to behave themselves the way that their lords, the king, and particularly the church wanted them to behave, because the church demanded this word piety from a knight. So part of chivalry was being religious and being, a good and holy man within that framework. So for example, a knight would have to attend mass regularly. He'd fast on Fridays, And this is going to be very important to us in the future, he was expected to first place his sword in the service of good causes. And that includes the church's cause. So the knight was expected first and foremost to defend the church. That was part and parcel of chivalry. And part of this is because medieval people believed that everything, your land, your ranks, they came from above, that they came from God. It also was, being a lord was pretty competitive. So the cult of knighthood and the competitiveness of all of this meant that they could get very competitive as to like who's the most religious, as a way to display like how chivalrous they were. So you're not going to go and watch a video about knights in a bit more detail. Going to flesh out some of those points with some more interesting enactments, and that's from the Terry Jones series, Medieval Lives, the Knight. Just inside, this is an interesting point to talk about good sources. Now, usually if you're researching for this class, I insist on scholarly sources, but the Terry Jones videos they're not strictly speaking scholarly, not like the Mary Beard ones you watch where, it was researched and written by one of the top people in the field. The Terry Jones videos you'll see have a much more popular feel to them, but they're for the most part pretty accurate, and that's because Terry Jones, as well as being a member of Monty Python, was like a amateur, very committed medievalist. He used to go to I never met him, but lots of people I know met him because he used to go to all the conferences. He was really into it. So he definitely, is a knowledge, was, he died this last 2020, took so many good people. But his videos are very good. He got good people, he did good work, and he hired good people to work with him as well. So those are reliable sources for us to use. And this has come up because the same day I'm making this, I'm finding the Jorvik Viking Center video for you about weaponry. And that was a real problem because a lot of the Middle Ages stuff about castles and chivalry and the Vikings and anything like this is being totally co-opted by very dodgy people who are really wrong, and they don't care they're really wrong. And so these things get a lot of hits and watches, so they come up very high when you search for them, and I don't want you to go and watch something that's very worrying like that. So which is why I wanted to find a video for you myself. So definitely watch the videos I give you, read the stuff I give you, watch my videos, listen in class, take notes, and then you can go and explore what there is out there on these subjects and do your own homework and criticism on it, because you'll see a lot of them are not good. Okay, so go watch your video. My next video is going to be a PowerPoint overview of peasants.